Has anyone ever wondered how the skinwalkers came to be? There are two traditional answers. One story says that they are old ones, original semi-divine beings made by those who shaped the earth, basically angels. The other story says that they are mystics or medicine men who chose to pervert their gift of shapeshifting and chose the witching way. The ceremony to make oneself a skinwalker centers around face painting. Particular designs intended to inspire horror are used. While there are other finer details regarding the ceremony, the face painting is the important part. There's an old Indian store near where I live. I'm from Tennessee, but the military has me living near Camp Pendleton. Anyway, the store is mainly a tourist trap, and it's even called the Indian store. They must get a lot of business because they usually have at least 5 employees working at one time, and I've never been the only customer there regardless of whatever time of day it happens to be. Anyway, last year I dropped in at the Indian store before Halloween to pick up some Native American stuff for a costume. My buddies were with me. I'll call them French and Cap. Anyway, I'm just getting a cheap headdress and a sheet of leather for a loincloth when I see a staff member that I don't recognize talking to French and Cap. He's making suggestions for costumes and talking to them like he knows them. He keeps calling them boys. Something about it just seemed weird at the time. Anyway, I got my stuff and checked out, so I go outside to stash it all in the car. French and Cap are still lingering inside, so I go back in and, the staff members got Cap loaded down with a couple of skins and a headdress that goes sideways with black and red feathers. Really strange looking thing. Then the old bastard takes them over to a wall and shows them a couple of paintings of native guys in face paint. He tells them to pick from one of the designs. Frenchie says he doesn't need that stuff. But the old guy keeps pushing, saying that if they keep with a traditional pattern, he'll go ahead and throw in the paint for free. So they each pick out a pattern, and the dude tells them that he's hosting a harvest season event with some friends that weekend. This is about a year ago, so I'm not 100% on the dialogue, but the point is that this guy is so charismatic that Cap, a black guy from inner city DC, and Frenchie, a black guy from inner city Philly, both agree to attend some bonfire shit in the desert that weekend. I told them that as a white guy, this is some deliverance, wrong turn off the freeway shit. I tell them that the dude and his friends are going to eat them, and that I won't feel bad about it. French and Cap, though, were adamant that this guy was legit. Like, at first they laughed off what I said, but when I tried to reason with them, they got defensive about the old guy. They got mad at me for talking badly about him. These are 2 of my longest-standing military friends, and here they were acting like this old dude they just met is somehow more important. But whatever, I dropped it. Anyway, to cut to the chase, I didn't go to this powwow shit. In retrospect, I think it's because I was outside when this old dude was laying the charm on super thick. Now, as a side note, every Wednesday night is guys' night. Me and Frenchie get together with friends, but Frenchie never showed up, didn't return my calls or texts, just dropped off the face of the earth. I start to worry at this point that these fuckers really did eat my friends. So I drive to Frenchie's barracks. I work for the chaplain's office, and I used my position to get in there for a comfort/well-being visit. He's in there, and he's fine, but he seems kind of jumpy. He was literally shivering. This is in Camp Pendleton barracks room, with no AC in mid-October, and the dude's shivering. Now, prior to this, Frenchie's always been a really relaxed dude, and now a year later he's back to his old self, but at this point in time, something about the powwow had obviously gotten to him. The lights were off when I came in, and it was a little dark, but I could make out marks on his hands. I flipped the lights on and I saw that his hand was burnt. Not terribly, but bad enough to go to medical. He was putting salve on his burns and rewrapping them when I barged in. After talking to him, I found out that he had fallen into the fire at the powwow. He burnt his hand when he fell over and tried to catch himself. Landed right in the flames. He had to go to the hospital that same night. Now, that explained why he missed guys' night. He'd been SIQ, or sick in quarters, and he wasn't supposed to leave the barracks. Now, let me explain something really quick. Cap was out of the Marines by this point. In fact, he was on vacation visiting us when we went to the Indian store. His plan was that he was going to see us for a few days, which he did, then head home to DC for the weekend. Then he'd be back to see us for Halloween. So since that was his plan, Cap headed to the airport after the powwow. Frenchie told me that he got a ride from the old man at the store, which I thought was kind of strange. Anyway, I said goodbye to Frenchie, and I told him to get better. Pretty soon Halloween was around the corner, and I was getting ready to see French and Cap again. But French wound up calling at the last minute, and told me that they were both really sick and would have to cancel. It sucked, but people get sick. I believed him. Or at least until his birthday I believed him. Now Frenchie's birthday is Christmas Day, and mine is just a few days before that, so we spent a few days together, and one night we got shit-faced. That's when he told me what really happened. I happened to ask how Cap was doing. Frenchie was better friends with him than I was, but his response was surprising. He just shut down. You know when you're going through a really bad memory, and you just kinda go numb while you're telling it? That's what I saw on his face. He didn't cry or anything, he just went blank. French told me that some parts of his memory seemed blacked out. He could remember the Indian store, at least about halfway through the visit, then not much else. He said he could also remember how I warned them that they'd die out there, at the powwow, and this was the confusing part. He remembers getting mad, but he says that it was because I was talking shit about his grandfather, not the dude from the store. He said that he can recall in his memory the old man looking like his grandfather. Now from there he told me a story. I'm just going to say it's a story, because I know it sounds far-fetched, and I didn't see it firsthand. In fact, the only thing I know for sure is that Frenchie had burns on his hands. I saw that. I'll also say, from my perspective, when I first found French in his room, he reminded me of a trauma victim, and as his friend I know that he just wasn't himself. He just wasn't the same dude. It took him a while to get back to normal, and he also started to drink a lot more. I also know Cap never made it to DC, and neither of us have heard from him. Frenchie tells me that he's pretty sure we won't hear from him ever again. And after Frenchie told me this story, he made me take all the stuff we bought at the Indian store and burn it. Anyway, this is what he told me. French and Cap drove up to meet the old man at the Indian store. Again, at this point, the memory is of meeting Frenchie's grandfather, not the old man. Anyway, they parked and got in the dude's car and drove up there with him into the mountains. Then there's just a hole in his memory, a chunk of missing time. And the next thing he remembers is that it's after sundown, and they're pulling up to an area between some mountains somewhere. Because it's sundown, he figures something like 2 to 3 hours have passed. 2 to 3 hours that he doesn't remember. The way he described it, I personally think that it's near Mount San Jacinto, but I'm not sure. Anyway, they got there and they set off on a bit of a hike. When they arrive at a certain spot, they started helping the old dude, just unpacking bags and getting firewood. Frenchie says this part feels like a huge red flag in retrospect, but at the time it seemed very routine. He didn't feel weird at all doing it. He said he was almost doing it begrudgingly, just like an old chore that made sense and needed doing. The old man wasn't there for a while, but his dog stayed and watched them as they gathered firewood and set up a massive pyre. Then the old guy returned and helped them put on their gear. He started to paint their faces for them while he talked to them. But Frenchie can't remember what was being said. It might have been singing. Either way, it definitely wasn't English, and he said it felt like he was being given rules or instructions. This was all happening to Cap first, with Frenchie waiting next to him. He thinks that's what saved his life. Either way, the next thing he remembers is the blinding pain. He was wearing some sort of a furry bracelet or something on his arm, and I guess he was just close enough to the fire so that it accidentally caught. He began shaking at it wildly. Then he fell into the fire, and the old man quickly grabbed him by the legs and pulled him off. When French turned around, he saw Cap having a seizure on the ground. He thinks now that the fire knocked him out of whatever the fuck the old dude had done to him. It was like he was coming out of a trance. Nothing felt routine anymore. It felt wrong. The old man didn't bear any resemblance to his grandfather. French said he looked like a predator, like he was hungry. The old man shoved French towards a tree line and shouted something to Cap, and instantly Cap stopped shaking. French watched as Cap pulled himself off of the ground. He was on all fours and he began to vomit. He claims the vomit looked black. Maybe it was just dark, but either way it smelled like death. Now this next part is where I called bullshit initially, but after thinking about it, Frenchie just isn't all that creative. What he said was that Cap got to his feet, but it didn't resemble him at all. He looked much taller and hairy. He told me that he was certain that it wasn't Cap. At this point, there's another blank in his memory, and then he remembers that he's running. He's being chased. He tumbled through some water. He remembers that the old man was following him, watching him, and the thing that used to be Cap was chasing him also. He was more scared of the old man, though. That thing looked like it was having trouble running, like it wasn't used to it, like it had new legs, and it seemed afraid of the streams. But the old man wasn't afraid, and he was right on French's tail. Then, suddenly, French came onto a highway. There were lights, and he saw that he was covered in thick dirt and soaked from the streams. Most of the face paint had washed off. He says he thinks it may have been blood. He began to run down the highway, and he was flagging at cars until he reached Palm Springs. Anyway, it's not a very climactic story, maybe, but it's the one I've got.